Well, so many of us have been saying for years, some of the older generation, has been saying this since, even before the Iraq War started. But the Iraq War was a total failure and was destined for failure, and it didn't even work in theory. There was absolutely no good reason, whether, even from an imperial standpoint, for the U.S. to invade Iraq. It's been clear for years now that was the case, that the U.S. Had absolutely nothing to gain, and that it was destined for failure, and that there was absolutely no way that the Iraq War could go well. And those of us who have felt that way have always said, gee, how could George W. Bush and all these guys be that dumb? Because, sure, you could say that some of them are very uninformed, which is clear, but there are also a lot of guys among the Bush administration and the Obama administration later on who, at the very least, were mildly intelligent and should have been able to see what was going on. And, how is it that, folks like, the CIA, for example, couldn't figure out, why the Iraq War was such a disaster? And thanks to new leaks now from some anonymous Iraqi who has leaked a bunch of 700 pages, I guess, of documents to the Intercept, which is, Glenn Greenwald's outlet. And, of course, Glenn Greenwald apparently shared them with the New York Times to try and get them to help authenticate them. They've now been authenticated, and both the New York Times and the Intercept has released this huge cache of documents. And it pretty much confirms that, yes, the Iraq War was a total disaster, and the U.S. government understood that and was very cognizant of that as the war was going on, as they were fighting the war. They understood that what they were doing was not even remotely going to achieve, the goals that they themselves set out for the war, the goals that they publicly espoused. They understood that what they were doing was actually counterproductive. Now let me bring things back and try to reel this in a bit, because hey, not everybody knows exactly what I'm talking about, and of course what I'm referring to is the U.S.'s mission in Iraq to, well, it's kind of vague and it's changed over the years, but a big part of it was, say, on containing tyranny and trying to stop the threat of the great big evil enemy Iran. One of the many, nonsensical theories touted around the time of the Iraq War, which pertained not only to Iraq but to Iran, was that there was this sort of they were using domino theory from the from the Cold War. If you remember, domino theory was when people used to say that, oh, well, if Vietnam goes communist, well, then all the countries around it will go communist, and there's this domino thing, and there'll be the domino effect, and all these countries will start falling into communism one after another because communism is so great. And George W. Bush felt the same way about democracy. He said, hey, you topple Saddam, what do you know next? There's going to be a wave of democracy across the Middle East, and everyone's going to, suddenly wake up, and all these guys in the desert are going to brush off their copies of the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights, and they'll go, you know what? We want to be like America. And then all of a sudden the Middle East will be perfect. This was what we were sold on, for the Iraq War. And, part of that they were talking about was the real big enemy, if how the great Satan, you could say, if Iraq was the little Satan, the great Satan was, of course, Iran. The neocons, the Bush administration, the bipartisan foreign policy consensus, they all hate Iran. And so implicit in all this talk about, democracy spreading across the Middle East was that, hey, if we take down Saddam, which is going to be pretty easy, then Iran's going to fall on its own. The Iranians are going to be so weakened because they're losing a tyrannical neighbor that was their mortal enemy, that they had fought a terribly brutal war with. By taking out Iran's greatest enemy in the world, Saddam Hussein, this somehow was supposed to destabilize their government. And, of course, one could have predicted at the time, for that reason alone, that the Iraq War would have the opposite effect. That by taking out Iran's greatest enemy, that you would only empower that country. It should have been a pretty obvious conclusion, but it wasn't. Everyone thought the opposite, at least, the people the respectable people in Washington who are allowed, to express their opinion, the so-called experts on foreign policy, the very same people who are lecturing us now about how the current president is a Russian spy. Those people back in 2003 said, hey, you take out Saddam Hussein, that's going to be terrible for Iran. There's nothing Iran would hate more than to have Saddam Hussein toppled. Now, of course, there's another reason why toppling Saddam Hussein would be a boon for the great state in Iran, which, by the way, I should specify. I don't really care about Iran. They're very far away from me. They're no threat to me. The Iranians have never, they don't have the capability to, somehow come over and start bombing Florida or whatever. That's not going to happen. So I don't really care what Iran does. But the people in Washington care very much about what Iran does. And, of course, the reason for that is because, everyone in Washington loves Israel so much, another country that I don't care about, that doesn't affect me and lives nowhere near me, and a place that I'll probably never visit, I guess unless some college conservative organization wants to recruit me, and they'll say, like, hey, you want to go to Israel? That'd probably be the only chance I'd ever have at going there. I'm, sure flights to the Middle East are kind of expensive. Wouldn't probably make the best vacation. And I'd like to go somewhere a little safer and happier. But anyway, that's beside the point. The folks in Washington love Israel. Israel, greatest ally, very important. Second only maybe to Ukraine, because of course we know now Ukraine is beginning to rival Israel as the most important ally for some reason. I guess just because Orange Man bad. So maybe after Trump's gone, Israel will go back to being, clearly on top. But right now, there's a clear rivalry. Who's more important, Israel or Ukraine? And it's certainly, they're certainly both well above America. They are both much more important to the people in Washington than the American homeland. And, of course, Israel has been, I guess an enemy of Iran since the 90s. They used to be close allies because, they used to ally with Iran against the Arabs that are all around them. But I guess Israel, at some point, there was a shift. I can't remember who was under. It was under one of the labor PMs in Israel. They decided to switch sides and ally with the Arabs against Iran. And that's how we got to the current position. But anyway, So Washington hates Iran, and they want to weaken Iran. And so Iraq, let's just get into it, is a country that has historically, even when it wasn't independent, been an enemy of Iran and of the Persians. And that's largely because Iraq has been run by people of the opposite faction of Islam. I won't get into the whole Sunni-Shia split and hereditary versus elective caliphates. But suffice it to say, they're kind of like the Protestants and the Catholics. They don't get along, and Iraq has historically been controlled by Sunnis, even though there is a Shiite majority in Iraq. And of course, Iran is the big Shiite country. They're all Shiites for the most part over in Iran. And so by taking out the Sunni dictator of Iraq and replacing him with a democratic state that elects its leaders, well then obviously if the Shiites are in the majority, well then you're going to have a Shiite-controlled government. You're going to have people of the same sect as Iran, people who have been living for decades and decades under Sunni tyranny, who have always looked at Iran in the same way that Serbia looks at Russia as sort of their big brother that defends them from the evil tyrants. And in fact, the Shiite opposition to Saddam Hussein had been exiled since the Iran-Iraq War in Iran. So these are people who sided with the enemy in a time of war, and I'm not saying that to shame them. That's the fact. And they fled to Iran, and these people came back after the 2003 invasion and were elected to be the government of Iraq. So you have literal Iranian agents, people who were supported by the Iranian government for decades, now running Iraq. Meanwhile, the United States is still in Iraq fighting on behalf of this government, on behalf of this pro-Iran government, supposedly, at least in part, to fight against all of this extremism that's being backed by Iran. If you remember that, they still use that line and say, like, oh my gosh, thousands of American soldiers were killed by Iran-backed terrorists. It's like, well, if you want to talk about people who are backed by Iran, it's the people that you are helping. It's the government in Baghdad. Those are the folks who are backed the most by Iran, not these silly little insurgents that happen to be Shiites that, may or may not have gotten some arms from Iran. All of that nonsense is, a large part of what helped discredit the bipartisan foreign policy consensus in Washington, because people who are, who have an IQ of at least 80, maybe you don't see it if you got an IQ of 70, but if you're at least an 80, you can see that none of this makes any sense and that it's absolutely preposterous. The U.S. was going on and bloviating about how, our boys are over there defending us from, all this Iranian-backed terrorism, evil Iran, at the same time that they're fighting on behalf of the Iranian allied government. And so, all of us at home looking at this just said, wow, the government is run by idiots who have no idea what they're doing. Or so we thought. But it turns out that the U.S. government isn't that dumb. Apparently they knew exactly what was going on, and they just lied about it. They understood the whole time that they were fighting and actually helping Iran. I guess what they couldn't do, the reason why they kept the war going and kept killing innocent civilians, in a war that killed over 1 million people by certain estimates, and of course kept getting more and more U.S. soldiers killed. The reason why they continued this policy was, I guess, because they couldn't admit they were wrong. And some people even trace this whole phenomenon back to 1996 in a paper, called The Clean Break, that was published by, I forget which of the neocons, Richard Pearl maybe, when he was working for Netanyahu. And, one of their big things was like, we have to just bring democracy to all these countries. And then all of a sudden they'll love Israel, because if you have democracy, that means that you love Israel for some reason. And of course, that turned out to be wrong. And one of the big things that the Clean Break advocated was overthrowing Saddam Hussein, and that freedom in the Middle East flows through Baghdad and crap like that. And so this paper got circulated around in neocon circles, and that echo chamber just kept reverberating off of itself for 7 years, from 1996 until 2003, when the Iraq War finally happened. And they all thought that they were real smart for having read this paper, and that they were on the cutting edge of history, and they were going to do all this great stuff, and they really just didn't think things through. They were so drunk on their own self-righteousness about how they were going to bring freedom and democracy, and how they were going to save Israel, the most important country on earth. And don't get me wrong, I'm not doing any I'm not saying Israel is like some dog whistle about how Jews are bad or something. Well, these guys were all very pro-Israeli. Some of them were Israeli dual citizens. Richard Pearl worked for Netanyahu and wrote this paper. And it's not just the neocons, even though the neocons were the brains behind this. There was also the evangelicals were huge in favor of all this crap, for the same reason, because they wanted to help Israel. And so anyone who's listening who thinks that because it's all about Israel, this is all about Jewish influence or something, it's much bigger than that. If only it were just Jewish people complaining and wanting for all this. If it was just the Jews who wanted this, they wouldn't be able to get this through. There's a lot of people beyond just Jewish folks who support all of this horrible stuff. And of course, there's a lot of good Jewish people who oppose all of this. So one should never, limit the scope of this horrible tragedy by, just bundling up in some broader, nonsensical Jewish conspiracy theory, because this really entangles the entire establishment, both the establishment of the U.S. And of Israel and of most Western governments. The Iraq War was an example where all the wizards of smart, everyone in the venerable intelligence community, quote unquote, all of the evangelical pastors, all of the politicians in both parties, they all were on the same side of this issue, and every single one of them were horribly wrong. And it should not be understated how evil the consequences of these people's actions were, and just how much death and destruction was wrought by their stupidity. Because once you realize that, you can never have respect for these people again. You'll never see the intelligence community as venerable. You'll never see bipartisanship as a virtue. You'll never see all of these so-called foreign policy experts as anything other than charlatans and warmongers. Charlatans whose only recourse when faced with rational criticism is to call people a Russian bot and to say, well, if you poke holes in my argument, if you point out that I've been wrong in the past and that I've been wrong for my entire life, well, then you're just the enemy. And, they're not wrong to call people like me and people possibly like you enemies of the state because, the state thrives off of these things. As far as John Bolton is concerned, for example, and he's not a neocon, but he's a very dedicated member of the bipartisan foreign policy establishment. He still maintains that the Iraq War was great because, hey, it was a way, and Jonah Goldberg has used these words in the past too. It said that it was a great way for America to punch somebody that criticized the U.S. government and to show that the U.S. government, that Washington, is the dominant force on the face of the planet, and that things will always remain that way. So it's very clear from the perspective of somebody like Bolton that at the very least these things are positive because it's a way of demonstrating our power. Or their power, rather. Of course, it's not our power because, I'm an enemy of the state, according to them. And I'm happy to be considered the enemy of such evil people. People who, were so shameless that even when they saw that their own imperial ends were not being served by their actions, that they kept sending troops into battle, that they kept bombing innocent civilians just to save face. So I'll need to remember to link to the Intercept in the description so that you folks can go read all of this yourself. Of course, probably not all 700 pages. That would be incredibly boring and not worth your time, considering that this just confirms everything we already knew. So with that said, if you gain anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and sharing this video. And if you haven't already, please do subscribe because I do upload every day and I'd hate to have you miss one. So I'll see you folks back here tomorrow.